I have the absolute honour and privilege now of introducing to you one of our ANROWS board directors, Dr Melanie Heenan. Melanie is the Executive Director of Court Network, a not-for-profit organisation that provides support to people going through the court system. Previously, she managed the Preventing Violence Against Women program at Vic Health that addressed the underlying causes of violence against women. In 2006, Mel was the first manager of the Respect and Responsibility program at the Australian Football League. In this national role, she was responsible for leading the strategy to build environments that are safe, supportive and inclusive of women and girls in the male-dominated football industry. Melanie's career has included more than 23 years of research, policy and practice experience. She was the inaugural coordinator of the Australian Centre for the Study of Sexual Assault. Mel has held previous positions with the Victorian Law Reform Commission and the Victorian Department of Justice. She was an original member of the Federal Government's National Council to Reduce Violence Against Women and their Children, and she's the brainchild behind this fabulous policy panel that we have this afternoon, bringing together these amazing women that you see on the stage now, and I'd like now to invite Melanie to come to the stage and introduce this amazing group of women to you.
Thanks, Heath. What a lovely introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Melanie Heenan, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you to this lounge room conversation with this panel of women, hosted by none other than ABC investigative journalist Sarah Ferguson. But before I do, oh yes, by all means. But before I do, I want also to acknowledge the history, culture and lands of the Kulin Nations, the custodians of this land. I express my deep regard and respect for the elders and community leaders past, present and future, and thank them, and Auntie Georgina in particular, for her generous words and her welcome to us this afternoon. I also want to very quickly acknowledge our very hard-working CEO, Heather Nancarrow, and our wonderful chair of the ANROWS board, Emeritus Professor Anne Edwards, and hi to my other ANROWS board members. It's really exciting for us to be here on day one, afternoon one of this conference. So now to a few words about this afternoon's session, research to policy and practice, and our panel. The idea for this panel came from our conference working group. It wasn't just me. We wanted to place the concept of knowledge translation and exchange right up front for these 3 days. In many ways, the concept of knowledge translation and exchange, or KTE, reflects a feminist principle set down many purple moons ago. If we are to research the lives of women in all their diversity who experience men's violence, if we are to surface its scope and impact, if we are to scrutinise the institutions, systems and services that respond to or fail to respond to its incidents, and if we are to determine and indeed get busy on what we know can prevent it, then in forums like this one, we must connect the knowledge we produce into real outcomes for women. We must connect the knowledge and the evidence at a policy level and at a practice level. ANROWS' mission is clear on this point. Indeed, it's a concept that is integrated throughout our funded research program. Researchers must identify in concrete terms how KTE opportunities can be realised. Some of the key questions that still really challenge us are how do we best operationalise knowledge? How do we understand and apply frameworks that drive integrated research platforms? How can we ensure research and evidence is accountable to changing structures and systems that help keep the rate of violence against women so ridiculously high? How can we use this evidence powerfully, persuasively? How can we use it to wedge? How can we use it to lay down misère? To help us grapple with these questions, we approached the 4 women who are on the stage with us now. I'm not ignoring you, Sarah, but I will get to you in a second. Our 4 women have variously used research and knowledge to build platforms for reform. They have led effectively, or they've built leadership in others that has influenced our nation, our neighbourhoods and even manhood to change. Let me introduce our panellist. I was actually thinking that if someone wandered into this conference room this afternoon and heard me introduce Candy Ann, Chika and Liz B, they might think that some new Spice Girl band was bouncing onto the stage. But this band of women are an entirely different variety. They have performed at the highest levels of policy and political leadership, and we've asked them to talk with us today about how they've used the the power of research, of evidence or of knowledge to drive a policy agenda for social change. Now, our Spice Girls have agreed to my cherry-picking from their almost irritatingly impressive bios to bring some of the highlights of their respective careers to you. Unsurprisingly, as you find with leaders, they were often first off the blocks with things that matter to the social world and, importantly, to women. Candy Broad is a former Victorian government minister. She was one of the drivers of the establishment of Emily's List and has been and remains an open and strong advocate for the reproductive rights of women. She was also one of 5 ministers in Victoria on a ministerial cross-government committee that monitored the impact of family violence reforms, the first of its kind to do so in the country at that time. And she is now a current director on the board of Women's Health Victoria. Chika, hope you don't mind that, Kerry. Chika was the first woman to lead the Liberal Party in New South Wales. She is chairperson of the New South Wales Women's Rugby and a board director, and in fact the second ever woman appointed to the board of New South Wales Rugby Union. What a fascinating governance experience that must be. Given this position, Chika will no doubt be promoting her new role as a member of the Our Watch board to them. Though it's hard to see what prevention and sport could possibly have in common. Not. Now to Anna. In the spirit of firsts, Anna was the 37th Premier and the first ever popularly elected woman Premier in Australia in 2009. She wore jeans and a belt and boots and a shirt, which was commented on ad nauseum as she led us through the devastation of the Queensland floods. Her leadership at this time was uniformly described as holding the state and people's lives together. She is now dedicated to the improvement of young women's lives as CEO of the YWCA in New South Wales. Liz Broderick, another underachiever when it comes to her contribution to policy. She pioneered part-time work for the first time at her law firm and remained partner miraculously. I'm assuming the sky didn't fall in, Liz, when that happened. Many of you will have worked alongside and or just plain admired how Liz has gone about her role for over 8 years as Sex Discrimination Commissioner. And of course she established the Male Champions of Change initiative, where the emphasis is on getting men at senior levels to engage other men to see the importance of gender equality as writ large if we want to make changes to the economic and social environment. In her own version of using knowledge to influence outcomes, she chipped away at one of the toughest institutions we have in this country, in the Australian Army, and transformed a man who was already a leader into one that even David Morrison himself sees as amongst his most important leadership selves. So that's our panel: Anna Bligh, Candy Broad, Liz Broderick and Kerry Chikarovski. A warm welcome to you all. Or in reverse, Chika, Liz, Candy and Anna unplugged. And now to our guest facilitator, Sarah Ferguson. Sarah is an ABC journalist who last year hosted the 7:30 report and was a formidable interrogator of politicians of both persuasions. We see her now on Monday nights hosting Four Corners as part of the compulsory viewing of the ABC Bonanza that happens on a Monday night. I know where you all are on a Monday night. But ANROWS especially wanted Sarah to facilitate this panel after the national screening of her documentary Hitting Home. Hitting Home lifted the public conversation from thinking the greatest problem we face with men's violence is the king hit on our city streets to the truth of where violence hits home for women. She sat beside women when they told us why they stayed. She let them speak the words that should have educated us all years ago about that. She showed them talking about their fears, that he will come, that it could be lethal, that she could die. She held children, toddlers living in refuge, and with them said goodnight to the moon. She looked squarely into the camera at the end of episode 1 and said this to us: "It's the thought of women with those children now in bed, in a refuge with locks on the doors, codes to get in. Hardly anybody knows where this place is, and all those women here, because the homes that they've come from are too dangerous one way or another for them to return to. And that's the situation that we tolerate in Australia." She told us about Elliot Coulson, a sailor with the Australian Navy who brutally killed Kate Maloney, and he was given a funeral with full military honours. Of course, the honours have since been taken away, all too late, many of us here might say. In her final message to us, Sarah said these words: "What I learned from the courage of the women who chose to speak to us was that their stories demand not just anger, but action." So here we are in a conversation about how research can support action. It's over to you now, Sarah, to talk with our panel about how this can best be done. Thank you.
Thank you on behalf of all of the panellists here for that lovely warm introduction. And just a quick note on, for me, the reason that I said yes when ANROWS asked me to do this, said yes straight away, was because they provided enormous help to us when we were making the documentary. And this comes back to the purpose of the discussion this afternoon, which is how you take knowledge and you apply it. You can't make a decision about how to make a television programme unless you know what the picture is. You can't make a powerful television programme unless you have the data to back that up. We couldn't make that programme in every state and territory. We knew we would be geographically restricted, but we needed data in order to make sure that the stories that we chose to tell were representative and would mean something to people from one end of Australia to the other. And in that, ANROWS was enormously helpful from the start to the finish. So that's why I'm here. It was an easy request to say yes to. But there is something that strikes me about this group of women, however marvellous they are, which is that we're all women. Anna, can we keep having these conversations women to women when the decisions are still largely being made by men? Grab your microphones.
I'm fine. I nearly took Sarah's microphone. Look, I've worked in and around the issue of domestic violence for, like Heather, nearly 30 years. Heather and I were both working in different women's refuges in Brisbane in our 20s, and here we are 30 years later. And while there's been extraordinary leaps forward by governments of all persuasions at all levels around, improved, police now have legislative tools they just didn't have then. There are services that did not exist then. There is a public understanding and knowledge that was not the case in the late 1970s and 80s. Despite all of that, there is no indication that we have had any real impact on incidents. And we have no real, nothing that suggests to me that 30 years of good, hard work has made the quantum shift that we need to have made. So there is no doubt in my mind that it's got to be the whole of society, and that the more I see men start to say to other men, a couple of things. Firstly, men being prepared to say to men, this is what men do to women. Let's not sanitise it, let's not pretend it's general, there's actually something gendered going on here, then that's a very powerful thing. And the more that we see men prepared to say to their mates and their friends and their colleagues, actually, I don't want to hang around with you anymore. That kind of behaviour has social consequences, and I'm not interested in a friendship with you, not to turn a blind eye. And there's plenty of men out there who are doing that, but not enough, and we need to find better ways of bringing them into the equation. And Sarah's absolutely right. While there are huge numbers of women making great inroads into the political corridors of power at all levels, they are still not in the majority, and it's male decision makers and leaders who we have to be prepared to get to and to know how to persuade them.
So, Liz, in terms of that point exactly, getting to and persuading, now you are someone, it's now unimaginable to go back a few years before the idea of male champions of change, of bringing men into the conversation, to imagine that point that it didn't exist a few years ago. Now, for you, that idea, did it come to you slowly? Did it come to you quickly? And my second question for you is, in terms of those inroads, how do you get people to be able to make their case in a way that's going to be effective and cannot be ignored?
Thanks, Sarah. And it's a great privilege to be with all the women on the panel here. Did it come to me quickly? No, I think I'm a bit of a slow learner. I came into the role of Sex Discrimination Commissioner 8.5 years ago now, and I think I came in and I thought, you know what? It's women working with other women. That's what's going to create change. And let's face it, it's collective women's activism that's pretty much got us to where we are today. So I stand in awe of what's been achieved over the last 30 years. But I started to understand that if we wanted to create change, just to rely solely on women was really an illogical approach, because women largely don't hold the levers of power. If we wanted to create change in the system, and so the one thing that irritates the hell out of me is we kind of think about, well, we need to fix the women. No, the women are okay as they are. We need to redesign the system. So if we want to do that, we need men and powerful men taking the message to other men. So that's when I hit on it, and I figured, okay, well, if that's the deal, I'm going to ring some of the most powerful men in the nation. So I'd love to say I did a whole lot of analysis and whatever. No, I just picked up the phone and I started ringing, which takes me to the second part of your question, Sarah, about how do we make the case for change compelling. And I think that's where, you know, all the fabulous researchers, academics, people in this room actually come into play. Because I can go as Liz Broderick with an idea and everyone might say, oh, that's a nice idea. I'm powerful when I go as Liz Broderick, armed with the research, the evidence base, the data that I regularly draw on from ANROWS, you know, the ABS, the different universities. When I go armed with that research, that's when I'm powerful. And that's what I did with the men. I went with the data, the research, which I drew heavily on, but I figured if we're going to create change, we need to move this from people's heads to their hearts. So just having the data by itself was not enough. And at that point, that's when I brought in Rosie Batty. This is well before she was Australian of the Year. I brought in Christy McKellar, a fabulous survivor of domestic violence down here in Victoria, to spend half a day with those men so that they would understand what it's like to live with violence, what it's like to get the call at work from your partner who says, I'm walking out on our 6-month-old baby. Or, you know, the partner who doesn't like the fact that you're taller than him when you're in your high heels, so he saws the heels off your shoes. How are you going to find a pair of shoes to go to work? They're the stories that I wanted the men to hear and understand. And I think it's that combination of hard data with qualitative stories, the deeply human face. That's what spurns people into action.
And does that mean that people who are in the business of research need to think about that as well? Because if you're focused on research, you're not necessarily thinking about stories. Now, we hear this word stories all the time. It's almost getting to the point where it's overused, notwithstanding the power that they bring. But do you think that people here engaged in research need to think about the individuals as well when presenting research? Or is it enough for them to present the data to you and you make the combination?
No, well, either way. I mean, I think very much I've learned about the power of a personal and really taking the personal to the heart of power. That's how you create change. So whether or not research needs both a quantitative and a qualitative aspect, ideally that's for the individual researcher to determine. But if there is no qualitative aspect, then I think at least for that researcher, academic, to have strong connections to those who have the stories. So either they can bring it together or indeed the researcher can supplement the work that they're doing through the human face. Because I've seen in my last 8 years, and even when I gave my speech at the press club as I stepped down, I didn't talk about the policy necessarily or the numbers. I wanted to paint the human face on the issues that I saw.
Now, Candy, can I just ask you, when you think how long you've been engaged in policy in this area, have you seen the quality of research and the way that it's applied, because this is what we want to talk about, its application, work done for its own sake in the end doesn't change the nation and it doesn't change women's lives, and this conversation only has any value if it is about an end where a woman's life and her family's life is improved. How has the data that you received, the research that you work with, changed in your working lifetime?
Well, if I think about when I was first engaged at the coalface in this area, then there was research coming forward from organisations like Vic Health about the impact of violence on health, women's health, and Access Economics, the economic impact of violence against women for the economy, for women, for communities, for business, for government. And that research was absolutely vital to winning the argument, making the case within government, with ministerial colleagues, around the budget table to get the resources. Initially some $35 million, it grew to I think $140 million over a period of time. but having that evidence, backing it up with the case studies, the stories about what this meant for individual lives, to personalise it, all of those things were really powerful. And to the researchers, the people out there who work so hard to collect this data, to analyse it, don't be in any doubt that when it's really strongly focused on achieving a policy result, it's of enormous benefit. I, as a minister, making that case, taking it through a ministerial committee, which I chaired, the interdepartmental committees that had all the government agencies, the Chief Commissioner of Police, having that data was really powerful in winning the argument. You know, there are always a long list of priorities for governments on how to allocate resources, particularly in areas like health and education, which are both really vital for this area of changing the story around preventing violence against women and children. And using that data was absolutely vital to winning the debates.
You used the word focus there, and that's one of the things that interests me most about these questions. When I arrived to make another series for the ABC last year about politics, about the governments of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, I arrived to find two researchers who'd been working for quite a long time and had amassed a mountain of research, but it had no connection whatsoever to the television programme that we were going to make. So while it was very interesting and they kept adding bits to it like a little treasure mountain, it had no end point. It could have gone on for 1,000 years and just been added to and added to. And when I arrived and started talking about the end product, which was the television programme, to be honest, they didn't really like it because it changed the comfort of what they were doing. Is there a danger that research becomes an end in itself if you lose the sense of the life that you are trying to change?
Well, I used the word focus, and the focus of the research that I was referring to was very much on how does government, how does business, how do government and community agencies, how do they need to change the story, change the service system so that for a woman experiencing violence who might be approaching a whole lot of different entry points to what we laughably referred in the early days to as a system. It wasn't a system at all. Women were getting very different responses depending on where they went to, what the entry point was. We recognised that we needed a common assessment tool. We needed the experience of people, largely women, working in the service sector to tell us how to do it, how to design it, how to make it work. And we needed all of government and all of the community agencies involved in designing that tool. That, together with the Police Code of Practice, led by Christine Nixon at the time, were two really vital tools that were developed. The focus of the research was on getting those outcomes. So yes, it has to be focused.
So how much responsibility is on the researchers themselves to understand? Now, I don't mean to have a go at you guys, I'm just trying to understand the best possible use, is how you understand the application of what you're doing. Is that sufficiently part of the framework of the way that information is gathered in this space in Australia, or does it need to improve, do you think?
Well, I think the responsibility is a shared responsibility. So in our case in Victoria at that time, setting up a statewide steering committee, which all of the parts of the equation that I've referred to were represented on. So we had all of those voices at the table, all able to contribute. That plus a government that was willing to accept that a woman's gender is the key risk factor for women experiencing violence, and recognised that we needed a whole of government policy in order to move to changing the system.
I think on that point, Sarah, that it is important to distinguish between research and activism, or research and lobbying. And some researchers might have, an interest in both, but I think there is a place for pure research, but it then is incumbent on people who have the ability to take that piece of research and take the three most important things out of it and then turn that into a story, illustrate it with someone, with something that they know has happened in their frontline service, and then use that to put to make it real to decision makers and to the public, because decision makers are going to be influenced by the weight that this issue has in the mind of the public. And it's very hard to do that in a very competitive environment of stories and issues, unless you can, I don't know any other word to say it in this environment, might be the wrong phrase, but a killer fact. And, it's only relatively recently, there might be other people in this room who have been using this data, but in the public's mind, that data that says, or that one fact that says every week in this country a woman is dying at the hands of her spouse, I've only really heard in the public and really socialised in about the last 2 years. And of all the data I've ever heard on domestic violence, it's the one that every time I say it, people who haven't heard it go, really? And it makes them think again. And it took us, I think, a long time to get to that fact. The data was always there. We always knew there was lots of women being murdered in domestic situations.
And yet, at the same time, one boy, tragic story, knocked on the head.
Yes.
Which is the point I was going to make.
That one story.
The most significant thing which has happened in a public sense in this whole debate, and I know there are people in this room who've been in this space for a lot longer than I was, but I was talking about this 20 years ago as the Minister for Women in New South Wales, so I've been around it a long time as well. But you cannot overestimate the impact of Rosie Batty and her story. You just cannot overestimate it. The fact that she has been able to live through such a tragic circumstance, turn it into something, and the word I would use is something which is relatable. And that's what has happened with Rosie's story. People out there in the community now go, oh my God, but for the grace of God, that could have been my child, that could have been someone I knew, that could have been the nephew, that could have been, the next door neighbour's child. And in that story, you can then use Rosie Batty's story to encourage people to understand what the statistics really are. I mean, it is a horrendous statistic to say that one woman every week is going to die at the hands of a partner or former partner. And when you start to say things like that, then the people who start to listen are, in fact, the people who will be making the decisions. It is no coincidence that after Rosie became Australian of the Year, that political classes on both sides of the House decided to put more significant money into preventive work in relation to domestic violence. People don't want to see another tragedy like that. They want to work as much as they can, political class as well. Now, the one thing I'd say about the research, and please don't take this the wrong way if there's anybody in the room who comes from this particular category of groups, I think the research is really important for the bureaucrats. And the reason it's really important for the bureaucrats is because they're the people who at the end of the day have to devise programs and cost them. And if you can provide significant research to them to say that if we have a program which will address this as a particular issue, and we believe from the research this will be a deliverable outcome, then you've got a bloody good chance of getting that sort of program up. Because we can talk about this all we like. We can talk and we can put more money and more money to it, but at the end of the day, we need to be able to persuade governments, and that includes their bureaucracies, that there are deliverable outcomes which this money will produce. And you can have all the research in the world, but unless you can actually show that this will promote change, then you can be researching to the nth degree, and you're not going to get the funding and you're not going to get the support to actually get those outcomes.
Anna, let me just ask you about that. Because you've been in the sector originally, then you've gone into politics, and now you're a CEO again. What is it that people least understand about the way government functions in terms of delivering the kind of outcomes that Kerry's talking about?
Look, I don't think that's any one single thing, but I might just give a couple of quick experiences because, like a lot of people who, I think, who end up in politics, I had a period of activism going in. So I was, a bit of a bomb thrower, someone, throwing issues up and wanting change, and then ended up in a position like Candy as a minister where I had to catch the bombs. And so I did get a bit of a sense of what worked and what didn't work. And I was surprised to some extent about some of those things. Firstly, really quite organisations that actually have quite a lot of power if they use it wisely, big peak bodies, whether they are employer groups, trade union groups, professional bodies, often would send in submissions, particularly when I was Treasurer, that were like a budget submission. And it would come in and it would be 95 pages long and they would be asking for 173 things. And I realised after a while that these were not submissions that were actually meant to influence government. These were actually about saying to all the members of that organisation, whatever your tiny little issue is, we've covered it off for you. I can tell you there is nothing more ineffective than a 95-page submission asking for 172 things. I just used to sigh with relief when I got those because I knew it's very hard for that to really put pressure on me. So out of that, I always say to people, if you can, throw one sharp spear and keep throwing it and throwing it and throwing it. If you've got one sharp spear, that it makes it impossible for people to ignore it. I think politics can look and feel very mysterious and opaque. But if you always think about it, the receiving end of your submission or your lobbying or your argument is just a human being. And eventually, every one of us has a point at which we will crack. And one of the things that also surprised me was how often people who had very just causes would actually give up. And so the other thing I say to people is persevere. Ministers are very, very busy people. They get lots and lots of things across their desk that are very worthwhile, that they would love to be able to do all of them. And as Candy said, you've always got to make some decisions about what's more worthy. And there's always some politics in that. And sometimes, the things that are really worthy often don't have very strong champions. And to try to elevate them in an environment where those other very strong, effective champions are continually throwing one sharp spear at you is very hard. So perseverance, with a cause that matters is, I think, a really critical thing. People are quite cynical and say things like, it's always the squeaky wheel that gets oiled. Well, there is some truth in that. At the end of the day, everybody at the receiving end of your lobbying efforts are human beings. And if you leave after the first rebuff, I'm very surprised by how many people did that. Whereas if someone is very passionate about something, and it might be very small, someone wants more respite hours for their disabled son in Winton in far west Queensland, and they don't give up. They keep writing a handwritten letter. The humanity of it is completely impossible to ignore. So often a handwritten letter, for me, had much more power and much more effect than a petition from a very well-oiled political, lobby group with 20,000 signatures, because it actually had this raw humanity to it that you couldn't ignore. So I always say, remember it's a human being, figure out what you think you couldn't ignore.
Liz, speaking of spears, I'll just go to Liz for a minute, if ever there was a spear. Now, what Kerry is talking about here, of course, is this moment that we have that not entirely due to Rosie Batty, but obviously an enormous part of shifting the paradigm. We see, horrible word, but we see paradigm shift so rarely. We have momentum now. What are the dangers that come with moments like this, when you actually suddenly, after bashing away at a subject for a very long time, suddenly everybody is paying attention, that perhaps the purse strings may be opened? Is there danger in that moment of momentum?
I do think there is danger, and the danger is that we all become complacent. Because let's face it, if I look back on the last 18 months of my term as Sex Discrimination Commissioner, the issue that we move furthest on as a nation has to be domestic and family violence, and also domestic and family violence as a workplace issue. There's a huge shift in that. And in a sense, we think, workplaces now get this. They're starting to understand why it is. The nation gets just the importance of doing something about domestic and family violence. I think in that moment, we can become complacent and we just assume that this momentum will continue. What we know, one thing we know for sure is if we take our foot off the pedal around change and creating a more gender equal Australia, it will naturally revert back. I mean, the 30 years of activism that we've seen have taught us that. And even seeing David Morrison step up as Australian of the Year, we see that when you step up and stand for women, actually you become a target yourself. which is, I think, part of the issue for David, who's really been a strong leader in the military. So I think the main risk is around complacency. I think, how do we move through complacency? It continues to be courageous leadership and well evidence-based research, so we continue to put the data up there, but coupled with the human face. That's what we need to do.
Candy, let me just ask you about that, because you've been working in this space for such a long time. At this moment, when suddenly everybody wants to be in domestic violence, everybody wants to commission a report, be part of the change, be associated with the change. I'm not talking about people here, but more broadly and particularly politically. Can you have too many reports? Is there a danger that we chase after too many different reports, too many different people trying to be the ones who bring about that change? How do you slow that down and keep focused on the projects that are going to work?
Yes, well, first of all, welcoming the spotlight and everyone who wants to be involved, I think, is really important, as overwhelming as that can be. For people who've been slogging away in this sector much more than I have. So I think that's a very important point, even though you can see some of the downside of that. Secondly, I think that focusing on embedding programs, one of the things that you really learn in government is short-term, 1 year, 2 year, even 3 year programs, when you're talking about embedding social change, just isn't going to get there, particularly when you build into those programs evaluation, data, which then can take you to the next step. So I think focusing on longer term investment, whether it's government, business or community organisations that are delivering services, is absolutely vital. So I think the way to sift out all of the proposals that might be put forward, all of the reports, is to look for the ones that are going to be focused on institutional change, embedding programs that you're actually going to get a chance to embed sufficiently to know for a start whether they're producing the results and the outcomes that you're looking for, and to be able to take them to the next step.
Kerry, how do you make that long term? We've got this extraordinarily volatile political universe in Australia, short political terms, very hard to keep momentum going in this particular area, and the tragedy that would be, it's unimaginable really that we could let this moment go, that we could look back and say, in 10 or 20 years' time, and say we didn't take sufficient advantage. How do you do it, given how fast politics shifts here?
Well, I think the first thing, the big advantage you have in this space at the moment, which is a terrible way to put it, is that both sides of politics are committed to change and to supporting change. I declare an interest. I sit on the Our Watch board. Our primary focus is primary prevention. We need to spend time and energy making sure that we don't have this as an issue. Now, we've recognised that that's going to be a long-term thing. It's not going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years. So first, declare an interest, as I say. Hopefully both sides of the House will decide to continue to fund Our Watch, because it is a long-term program, and that's at all levels of government. I think that it has now become so embedded across the public arena that this is wrong. This is wrong, but more important, that this is preventable. And I think while you've now got the public starting to think along those lines, it's interesting that we've done some research on one of the things we run, which is The Line, which is where parents are now starting to have these conversations with their children. I mean, previously, maybe you didn't really need to talk to your teenage sons about respectful relationships. Maybe you didn't think that was something you as a mother or father thought they needed to have a conversation about. Well, the reality is it is. So I think that longer term, this will be an ongoing commitment from all sides of politics. I suppose if I was a researcher in this space at the moment, I would be thinking about how we can start to research what that attitudinal change is now producing. Is it producing, because we've been talking about these issues for a very long time, has there been a shift in the attitude over the last 10, 20, 30 years? I think there has. What do we need to encourage that shift more? We're talking about respectful relationship programs in school. I think that's entirely appropriate. So what we need to do, though, I think, to entrench this and to actually get to the stage where we actually don't need this as an issue or don't need to have research on it anymore, is to actually work out what are the strategies that governments, political parties, all levels of governments will continue to support in order to get long-term, sustained, complete change.
Do we need, sorry, I was just going to say, I have this, do we need ministers for women? Or is ministers for women just a way of it not belonging to the whole government?
Well, you know, I was the first standalone minister for women, had the first standalone ministry in the country back in 1993. When we were talking about the name of the ministry, there was some suggestion amongst my staff that we should call it Women 2000. And I said, why would you call it Women 2000? And they said, because by 2000, all the issues facing women in this country will be resolved.
I used to think that.
Well, I had enough foresight to say, well, you know, I'm not actually going to do that because I don't think that's going to happen. And I did actually recall that there had been a certain Tory Prime Minister who had said that no child was going to live in poverty by 19, whatever it was. So I decided, no, we wouldn't do it. I think the reason we need to continue to have ministries for women is not just to keep the focus on the issues, but it is also to remind people that there is a way to go. And I think that's, you know, again, I'd love to get to the stage where there are no ministers for women. I think that would be the best thing in the world. But the progress between 1993 and 2016 in some of these issues has been terrific, and all power to people like Liz for encouraging, you know, better employment practices, better, you know, flexible working conditions, all those sorts of things. Fairer pay, oh, that'd be great, equal pay, all those sorts of things. But there are still so many issues which are specific to women, which I think we need to have someone reminding men who sit in cabinets that they have to have as much responsibility for these issues as the female members of those cabinets.
What were you going to say?
Well, it actually goes on from Kerry's point. When I look at some very successful examples of public policy shift that required a long horizon, and there are a couple of features to them, not uniformly, but firstly, as Kerry said, they are agendas that have a very broad bipartisan acceptance. And, you know, one good example of this is the road toll. The reduction in the road toll in Australia is the most extraordinary piece of public policy. It reversed a trend. If you look at the graph from about 1980, you see this incredible downward trend in road deaths at the same time as a rapid escalation in the number of vehicles on the road. And there was a number of parts to that, but everybody understood that it would be, you know, a long-term thing. When they started out, I remember when seatbelts became compulsory, and my father whinged about it like every other, you know, driver. It was not, you know, these things seem so obvious now, but it was a very courageous decision for the government of the time to tell people what they had to do in their cars, and people hated it. And they hated random breath testing, and these were not popular things. But one by one, they've had an effect over a period of time. But one of the features of that campaign, along with others, is that there was a target set. We were going to halve it. We were going to have a target 500. Last year in Queensland, about 220 people died on the roads. But I remember when we had a target in Queensland to keep it to 500.
Does targeting ever just set you up for failure?
Well, it's a very courageous thing to do, and Kerry's right about that. But I think it depends a bit on how you do that. So closing the gap, for example, is a set of targets that are very ambitious, but I don't think there's any disagreement that they are the kind of targets we should have. Then what that means is it holds the government of the day to account to keep this issue on their radar. They may not always get the initiatives right, but like the Closing the Gap report, it brought it back onto the front of the papers and said, look, we're actually making progress in a couple of these, and in others we're falling behind. Emissions targets. There is things fall off the radar, and Liz is right, complacency is a problem. But even if you're not complacent, there will be other things that from time to time will just take over the news cycle, because there will be a big issue that happens, a big event that causes everybody to look somewhere else. And so what a target does is, drive the political attention back once a year or twice a year when you have to report, or as you get 2 years away from when you said you would achieve it. And it doesn't seem to me to be that difficult for us as a nation to say, to set something like either we believe that we can get rid of that statistic of one woman a week within a generation, or maybe even faster. And it is very complex. But if you think about when they started saying we're going to start cutting the road toll, they hadn't invented random breath testing technology. When they set the target and said, well, you don't want so many people to die on the roads, people started to put money into looking at ways that you could actually do it. So I think there's a bit of chicken and egg there. That's a very powerful thing.
Go on.
And I was just adding on to Anna's comments. I mean, I think the major learning from a Male Champions of Change is that without a target, nothing will change. So I absolutely agree with you. Just to add to your comments about target, not only does it signal public intent, hold people accountable, particularly targets with teeth, which is what we need, but when you have a strategy that's not delivering against it, you're much more likely to throw that out and try something else. So I agree.
And Kerry's right. It is a very difficult and courageous thing to do in politics because, you know, most people don't meet their targets on the date they said they'd meet them. But you know, somewhere along the way, big changes can happen because of it. And so you've really got to decide sometimes between your own personal political safety and the progress of the issue that's bigger.
But can I just say, in this particular space, there should be no concern about personal political, safety.
But is that possible?
Well, no, because I don't think that this is... I mean, this is not like... And I don't want to get into any debates here, but this is not like industrial relations where there are completely different views in terms of, the politics around IR. In the politics of domestic violence, there is only one outcome, and that outcome is something that both sides of politics can agree on, and that is no more deaths, no more children hurt, no more women hurt, no more violence. I mean, that's the outcome. That's the outcome we want to achieve, right? And because there is no politics around that, because there's no upside or downside in standing for that. There is only the right side, and that is to stand for it. So I actually think that it's actually easier in some ways than the road toll. It's certainly easier than people who took positions around smoking bans. There were some people who were not, politically, who were not concerned, who were not on one side or the other of the smoking ban, right? There were people who were saying, freedom of, all this is impinging on personal freedom if we start banning smoking. Well, I mean, it took some people a long time to come to the view that really what they should be doing is looking after everybody's health. In this debate, there is not that taking sides. In this debate, there is a common cause which says we have to act.
Did you use targets in the work that Steve Brack's got you to do, for example? Was that target driven?
Yes, absolutely it was driven. So it was around things like ensuring that more women had access to the services they need. That might have been housing, it might have been making it safe for women to stay in their own homes, access to legal advice and support, court support. So in all of those areas there was a major ramping up. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't women who aren't missing out. There are, and there's still a lot more to be done. But there was an immediate recognition that all of those areas had to be ramped up significantly.
It's a bit unfair just to start with you on this question, but what did you get wrong? If you go back to the early years of the 2000s, for example, when large amounts of money starts being put into the sector, or more money is put in, when you look back now, are there things that you can see that would have been more effective, that you could have done better?
Look, at the time, notwithstanding taking a lot of advice from service providers across the sector, from frontline agencies like police, courts, notwithstanding all of that advice, it was a very difficult thing to move forward on an integrated approach to prevention of family violence. Not everyone agreed with the direction that the government took. Not every agency was a beneficiary of those major system changes. Hopefully, the outcomes that have been achieved mean that it was worth it. But I'm absolutely confident that there are lessons to be learnt from that experience, that we can do it better going forward, and we have an obligation to do that.
Now, Liz, you can't argue against having a male champion of change, but you can argue against flexible working arrangements, for example. Where do you see the biggest pushback coming in relation to really a reset of the way that people's expectations are around the workplace?
I still think it's where the greatest pushback is It's not necessarily in relation to flexible work. I mean, there's still people who just don't get that we need to fix the system rather than the women. They'd still like to look at women from a deficit model, more mentoring, more networking, more this, more that. No, actually, it's a failure of imagination. It's a failure to imagine what a gender equal workplace, what a gender equal Australia would look like. So for me, when I go in and I talk to people, I leave them with one message. I say, look, if you don't actively and intentionally include women, the system will unintentionally exclude them, because pretty much every institution you look at, whether it's the parliament, the military, wherever it is, that's deeply rooted in a male way of being. And sometimes I get pushback from people who just, because it's not visible, they don't think it exists. Just to give you one example of that, I mean, I talk about gender asbestos. I talk about the fact that in most places in Australia, it's not that there's overt discrimination. A lot of that formal discrimination has been moved away. But what we're left with is the biases, the stereotypes, the attitudes that are built into the walls, the floors, the ceilings, the practices and the structures of organisations. So don't tell me just because you can't see it, it's not happening. I can assure you it's absolutely there, and it'll take both men and women to change the picture.
Anna, in your career, in your political career in Queensland, what were the hardest obstacles for you in terms of bringing about the kind of change that we're talking about? Obviously, it's been going on for a long time. What did you have to fight with most?
Gosh.
Tough question. Big.
It feels like you fight every day sometimes in those jobs. I think culture. The hardest thing to change is the culture of organisations, big organisations, as Candy talks about, big government departments. If you want to ask the police, which is a very hierarchical chain of command, authoritative organisation with a long centuries of history, and a very particular male culture, particularly at the time I was there. To then start working hand in hand in an integrated way with not-for-profit, women's-run organisations in the community in a way that actually benefits the people who are victims of serious crime, that is women in domestic violence situations. But that is a really big culture clash for both sides, massive. And I think I certainly underestimated sometimes how long culture takes to change.
So notwithstanding what you're saying about road toll,
yep.
That's the nitty-gritty, isn't it, is the battle with the culture?
The battle with the culture there, but I also think in this particular issue, I think the road toll is a good analogy on one side, because it is a good example of a public policy that worked and it took 30 years to do it, but it's actually a remarkable piece of behavioural change. But it is far less complex than what happens in gendered relationships in people's home lives. And the complexity of it sometimes, I think, wears down the imagination of what we could do next. And I think if I could say to the people in this room, one of the most precious things in government is when you've got people who are outside of government who have either the resources to do some research that's very, very useful, or who have the lived daily working experience of the front line, who can actually then come up with ideas about what to do next. And to have the courage sometimes to say what we're doing is not working. But if we were able to do it this way, if we thought about doing it that way, then we could do it better. And I think when I look at some of the big improvements that lasted, they often came from outside the organisation, outside of government, more often, or just as often as inside, some very capable people working in the public sector. But it's not the same as working on the front line with victims, with perpetrators, with the criminal justice system. So it's that cultural piece that, for me, was always how do I get over this? How do I get people to think differently? How do I make them, confront them with the reality of how women and children are living lives in their streets, in their workplaces, that they would regard it, that they would just find unimaginable.
How do you teach people to deal better with government? How do you get people to be able to get what they want out of government?
Well, look, I'd go back to something Anna said earlier about champions. And I think one of the most effective things you can do as an organisation wanting to work with government is to realise that there's a whole lot of people who sit on the back bench as well. Not everyone's a minister. Everybody wants to be a minister, let me tell you, but not everyone is a minister. And I think that if you've got someone who you know who has a passion for what you're doing, then get very close to them. And make sure that they're getting very close to the people who will make the decisions about what you want. Because at the end of the day, ministers do have to talk to their colleagues, they do have to spend time with them. I spend a fair bit of time in Canberra at the moment for a whole lot of reasons, and there are certain people who I have identified for the people I work with who are passionate about the things that my clients are wanting. So we go and we make sure that they fully understand what the issue is, and we and please don't take this the wrong way, and I'm not quite sure whether this is being broadcast, but we explain it in very simple terms, right? Very simple terms. And the reason we do that is because politicians, and it doesn't matter where they sit on the political scale, they all get inundated with a lot of information. So if we go back to the start of this conversation when you talked about stories, if you actually go and watch parliaments, some of the most effective speeches you'll hear in the parliament will be when people get up and they are actually visibly moved by what they're talking about. And those ones tend to get broadcast, apart from anything else. But the reason that they're visibly moved is because they've related to what you've told them. They've actually come to take your passion and make it their passion. So find people who are in the space. Now, it's a little bit more difficult because I can't imagine that there are too many people in Parliament who are going to quite openly put up their hand and say, look, I've had either an experience of domestic violence or I know people who have. But I think if you went and spoke to some of those people quietly, they'll probably find, like everybody else in this room and everybody we know in the community, pretty well everyone will have had some experience of domestic violence. Tap into that. Get them to become your spokesperson about what you want. Because finding champions like that, who are committed, who are passionate, and who want you to succeed, is very effective ways of bringing to both oppositions and governments a perspective, a point of view, which maybe ministers don't have the time to actually go into.
Do you recall anybody, in your own experience, anybody who cut through delivering a message to you?
I had one particular colleague who had an issue, a police issue. I was leader of the opposition at the time. He had an issue with the local police in his area. We didn't take it public, but he came to me, and it was quite complicated in terms of the issue, but together we went to the Minister for Police on the opposite side of the House, which was interesting, but we also got permission to go talk to the Commissioner, and we got it resolved. It was quite complicated and quite difficult, and I'm not at liberty to go into the details of it because it was done quite privately. But he was in my office because he had a constituent who was in tears over this issue and coming to him almost every day on it. So we worked together to get a resolution. But there's all sorts of things like that. A lot of them you won't see publicly because they will be done privately, but on an issue like this, I have no doubt that politicians will give you very public support, but you need to work out how to approach them and how to tap into them. And the best way to do that is to go and actually knock on their door and be really honest about what you want with them. And as I said, provide the stories. They're listening at the moment.
And I'd add to what Kerry said about champions. The other one is people who are in the public sector in these positions. Yep. Because they'll often be in these positions and work their way up in influence in the organisation over 25 years of a working life through maybe 4 or 5 or 6 governments. And so they often have very significant influence. And to exercise the influence and power that they have in their positions, they need your stories, they need the research, they need something that they can then lobby the next minister for the next piece of the puzzle to take us forward another step.
Canny, let me just bring you in here. We started out by talking about the importance of research. It's the reason that we're all here, is how we apply research to bring about lasting change. What about bad research, bad data? It gets into the public domain. It's very hard to battle. How do you fight bad facts, bad data that's used so mischievously by people who would slow down the sort of change we're talking about? How insidious is bad data?
Well, what I might relate this to is my position as a Director of Women's Health Victoria. So when I was still a Member of Parliament, before I was a Director of Women's Health Victoria, I was battling through the processes in parliamentary parties, talking to all parties about legislative reform for women's sexual and reproductive rights. there was the most misinformation, much of it derived from the United States, I think, around why women were going to die as a result of any of the legislative reforms that were being proposed. And Women's Health Victoria, which I have to stress I was not a director of at the time, was absolutely vital as far as I was concerned in providing me with well-researched data, evidence, case studies, information from around the world based on professional standards, practice in other jurisdictions to counter that misinformation. So, I mean, that didn't happen by accident. Women's Health Victoria was established by a much earlier Labor government, the Kane government, and resourced to do this kind of work. So it's not party political, but it's there as an institution to provide the facts. And I was in a position where I drew on those really strongly to make sure that members of Parliament had the facts so that they themselves could respond to the misinformation, the bad so-called research that they were being inundated with.
Liz, how important, well, both of you, how important is it to fight back against bad data, bad research?
Absolutely. But on this, I was going to say champions work both ways. And sometimes I think that people who have actually got very influential voices in the community sector or from academia sometimes aren't loud enough in being a champion when they see a government doing the right thing and under attack from people who are spreading misinformation. So, just two very quick experiences that I had. When the vaccination for teenage girls to prevent cervical cancer became public, and there was a big backlash about somehow how having this vaccination would lead to outrageous promiscuity, as if young girls are hanging back from sex because they thought it might cause cervical cancer in the first place. I don't know. But anyway, but it was incredibly important and powerful that very well organised and respected organisations of doctors came out and championed that vaccination. Medical practitioners, whether they were nurses, specialty groups, it wasn't just government fighting back against that. Similarly, when I introduced fluoride into the water in Queensland, which for some reason just is the most controversial thing you can do.
No, daylight saving is the most controversial thing in Queensland.
But having groups of dentists come out and say how important it was. And I'm not suggesting that you always have to, applaud or approve governments, but when you actually want a long-term campaign to be sustained, when you see it being under attack from, very well-organised systemic misinformation, often governments can't be the only ones being the champion of the cause. And
do you think people hold back too much? They see something that they regard as being nonsense or rotten, and they think, well, I'm just not going to engage.
Yes, so often they don't realise how much that stuff is gaining traction and how important it is to have other voices. And how often people assume that, the government the government would say that, So the fluoride lobby are out saying, crazy things about we're mass medicating people, and I say, no, we're not. And everyone goes, oh, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? And you need third parties because you're seen as self-interested in the defence of whatever the government's policy is. So, not every government policy is there, should be defended. But, when you see particularly a minister or a premier or a government under attack for something that you think is really important to progress, again, I've seen those sort of one step forward, and then your colleagues, the support for it in Cabinet and around the budget table starts to whittle away because it doesn't seem to be doing any good out there. And suddenly you've gone two steps back.
Liz, do you see the same thing? Do you think you should take up the cudgels when you see misinformation at whatever level? Is it everybody's job to get into that fight in one way or another?
Look, I think it is, but you run the risk that you give it more oxygen. And I mean, I'm just thinking about some of the commentators saying, Mark Latham as one example of, putting out misinformation around domestic and family violence. You do run the risk when you weigh into that debate that may just shut down the next day, that you give it more oxygen, you give it a new angle.
So how do you make that judgment?
That's the only caution I would have. I mean, for me, I make a determination as to whether I want to be early in the debate or wait to see how the debate plays out. And as I went on in my term, I got, I think, better at doing that, because ordinarily I think I have to be one of the first voices in. I've learned, over the years, no, it's better to see whether that debate's going to take off and come in a very evidence-based way midway, and that's where everyone's research became very, very important, because you can just give it a whole lot of oxygen that it may not have had otherwise.
But Sarah, before you say
take
anything, I have a
Anna's
question
point.
for you. I mean,
novel.
No, but seriously, I mean, what do you think is the responsibility of the media in that debate? Because, I mean, if the Mark Lathams of the world were not being given a voice by the bloody, is it The Age or the Herald or whoever it is now, I think it's now, wherever he's gone now, if the media weren't giving those people a voice, then a lot of that misinformation would not be out there. So what's your view on the responsibility of your colleagues?
The responsibility, no, it's a good question. The responsibility is always there. Now, making a judgment on whether or not there is sufficient legitimacy, let's not say sufficient, but some legitimacy in someone's argument that it's worth hearing, it's a very complex decision, and clearly people apply very different standards, that some people like a lot of noise and light, but all the media, from the most serious to the most fluffy, likes colour and movement, so it applies to all of us. I'm not excluding myself from that. So yes, we have a responsibility, but I noticed this, that you because of a certain squeamishness about getting into the debate, and I understand the oxygen issue, for me the problem is, where is the evidence? If I've given somebody, let's say I've given someone a voice, I don't want to make it about Mark Latham because we spend too much time talking about him, but whoever it is, I want to hear people come back with the evidence quickly. And it's true that often people will hold back, that they think that this is an unseemly debate, it's improper, it's not the kind of debate that I'm used to having. I'm used to having a debate that's properly evidenced. This one isn't, therefore I won't step into it, and it does leave a vacuum. I've been in that position where I've had to go out and not encourage, but ask people to get involved who I think should naturally step forward. Now, in this particular area, this debate, the Latham debate, was so out there in one sense that it's a good example of a place where you might pause. But I think the people in this room have the evidence. It's now collated so much better than it used to be. As you said earlier, Anna, the killer fact, the killer stat, forgive the expression, but because these things are now, the language in the national plan is so much clearer, the English is stronger, people understand communication so much better, that I think they should get in quicker. Now,
and you'll guarantee that the media will publish what we want to say.
No.
That's the issue.
No, but I would say this, and this is one of the things that I wanted to ask you guys about just as a final thing, and I ask it because it's my field, but in relation to media. So we're talking about the relationship between research and policy. Do you think that you must also have a parallel conversation with the media all the time? Can you bring about this change if you don't make us part of that triangle?
Absolutely not. You can't bring about the change. I actually credit the media with actually stepping up on domestic and family violence. Look at, Shine the Light and some of those media campaigns which have just been so successful on keeping the focus on this issue. But one of the things I would say though, and I'll be interested, Sarah, what you think about this, is sometimes when the media reports, particularly domestic and family violence, and we talked before about what if moments. What if? And for me it was what if, and the particular example I use was the family violence that occurred in Lockhart River in New South Wales last year. And it was reported as, there are 4 victims. Well, no, there's 1 murderer and 3 victims. But the whole narrative and reporting, and I see how it eventuated because it was led by the family's response. And it is really hard because it's in a period of grieving for the family. But I just think it kind of led to a reinforcing of that attitude that these things happen and he's a good man in the community and, he sponsors the local
If
soccer
he had
team.
not been their father,
yeah,
it would have been a completely
totally
different report.
But I just think, you know, that there's so much that's great about the media, but then we see some examples where we need to shift the way it's reported.
Well, let me throw that back on you, because there is some movement in this area, but at the same time, when we get it wrong, if you work with us, I've said that some of the people in this room who worked on Hitting Home, they educated us, and that's what you have to do. I'm not saying we're not responsible. Of course we are responsible, but you have a responsibility too to make us better and to demand more of us. So if you become involved with the media, I'm talking to the people in the room, you have to have very high expectations of how we're going to behave, and not just assume that we're poor and that it's not going to come out the way you want. You need to hold us to the highest possible standard, and if you keep after us, people's behaviour does improve. It's the same way you respond in government to someone who goes and goes and goes. If you keep complaining and keep saying that my language is wrong, because I make terrible mistakes in reporting on domestic violence. Moo Bolch is here. She's heard me say awful things, but she still talks to me because she's been educating me over a period of time. It's the same with Fiona McCormack. They don't shut us out when we make mistakes. They educate us, and that is everybody's responsibility to hold the media to the standard that you want. Don't just accept that we're poorly motivated and a bit awful, though we are. Hold us to that standard and hound us to that standard.
So when I was talking about finding champions in the political process, you need to find champions in the media as well. And I think we've got one here very clearly, so congratulations, Sarah. But can I also just add to that, how many people in this room wrote to the media and objected to not only the Lockhart, but the photos of the families drinking, giving farewell drinks on the pier in South Australia when the bloke drove into the water? The image of that family saying, bye-bye, thanks very much, you know, we're really going to miss you. Of all the reporting that I saw on that story, that is the thing that haunts me. And I understand, I go back, you're absolutely right, we understand that it's the family who might be feeling about, you know, the fact they've lost their son. I can't believe that the grandparents were there because they lost 2 grandchildren. But the fact that the media continually showed that imagery, I was absolutely sick on the stomach. I was just so sick on the stomach because that man did not deserve that. And he did not deserve the media allowing his family to eulogise him that way. So I think we collectively have a responsibility to say that is not acceptable.
But Kerry's right. When you see it, complain. Like everybody, we respond to complaints. Now we've come to the end of the time that we have allotted to us. I feel as though I could go on talking all night, but we've just a tiny little scratch of the surface. But on behalf of ANROWS, I'm sure there'll be more thanks to come, but on behalf of ANROWS and myself, I'd like to thank all of the panellists for their wisdom and the sense and the practical way in which they've responded to the questions, because we can talk theoretically for hours, all of you people can do it beautifully, but taking that theory and applying it for the sort of change that we want in women's lives, that's what we want. We want women's lives to be different, and if anybody can do it, you can do it with their help. So thank you, all of you.
Thank you.
Goodness, what to say at the end of an hour and a half like that. It felt like about 20 minutes. Sarah said, tell me when I've got 10 minutes to go. And I looked at my clock and it was 5 to already. I think what we've heard from the panel and what we knew we might hear from the panel is the power of research to build bipartisanship in terms of the ways in which they've been able to each describe different really seminal moments or watershed moments through which research has had a huge impact on their leadership capability or in the ways in which they've been able to influence change. We knew that the sum of the parts of this panel this afternoon was going to give us the unique insights. We knew individually there's huge integrity, huge leadership, huge courage from all of these women, but we knew the sum of the parts was going to give you something very special this afternoon. So please join me again in thanking our 4 panel members, and please also thank Sarah Ferguson, who we think has become a newer friend to the sector. Thank you so much.